Hi folks, this is going to be my explanation of the Muldowney Protocol as I understand it. I heard about the Muldowney Protocol and I was interested in it, but I was never really sure exactly what was in it, and I wanted to know about kind of the nitty-gritty details of what exercises and what progressions and what kind of schedule they had you on. And I found some reviews of the Muldowney Protocol of people using it, and mostly positive. But I wanted to know more kind of nitty-gritty details and an overview of the structure of it. So that's what I'm going to try to do here. It's all personal opinion and just, my limited understanding of it. But I've read it a couple times, and I think I got my head around it. And so I'll go through and just try to give a fair representation of the contents. And then at the end, maybe I'll share some personal opinions about who this might be appropriate for, who it might not be appropriate for, and potential shortcomings. So, to get right into it, it's got a great introduction. He talks about weak muscles versus tight muscles. He mentions posture, and a lot of good information if you're unclear of the details of EDS and symptoms. And if you'd like insight into maybe how a physical therapist would view these, it's got a lot of great information about that and kind of nitty-gritty details about, sublux vertebrae and this and that. And then there's also a solid appendix which goes through, all the different, well, not all of them, but some comorbid conditions and stuff like that. But also early on, it's got a pretty extensive list of rules for following it. So if you want a very structured approach, this kind of lays everything out, even to the point of where if you have a setback, it has a prescribed response where I think you drop down a level on your exercises for 2 weeks, something like that, which could be the right number for some people and some setbacks, but I think there's so many minor injuries that can crop up with EDS or hypermobility issues that stepping back for 2 weeks after every setback seems like quite a lot. But there certainly could be some people who would really benefit from that structure and having rules and saying, no, you can't progress with this exercise, you're injured, and so you need to be careful with this area, and so we're going to give it 2 weeks at this lower intensity level, and then start to ramp it back up. So I think that could be perfect for some people. To me, it seemed a little restrictive. But on the other hand, it's great that he lays out a real detailed structure, so you don't necessarily have to be, making these decisions sort of, in a wishy-washy way. You've got a structure you can follow. But anyways, let's carry on. The exercises are split into 3 different progressions, primarily. So there's the pelvis low back progression, and that's the one you start with. And then there's the neck, mid-back, and upper extremity progression, and that's the second one in the book. And then there's the lower extremity progression. And as I said, I've read this a couple times, and going by the strict reading of it, he says that you should go through the progressions in the order that they're explained. So from what I understand, he's suggesting that you hold off on the neck, mid-back, and lower extremity stuff until you've really got your pelvis and low back stabilized. And this makes sense from a physical therapist sort of perspective, to stabilize the central core and then work outwards from there. I think that seems fairly sensible. I'll save my personal opinions for the end. But that's kind of the structure, is that pelvis, low back, and then mid-back, upper extremity, and then lower extremity. And then after that, there's an at-home program which has all of those kind of mixed together into a weekly structure. So Monday and Thursday, you'd do the sacroiliac joint and lumbar progressions. Tuesday and Friday, it would be neck, mid-back, and upper extremity. And then Wednesday and Saturday is lower extremity. So it's basically a three-way split, and you repeat each exercise progression twice per week with a nice gap in between. And then after that, there's also some optional progressions. There's a twisting progression, there's a throwing progression, which isn't actually just throwing stuff. It's using bands to, I assume, strengthen stabilizers involved in that throwing motion and probably the decelerating muscles on the back. And then there's also balance progression, which seem to be stair-based and sort of, using handrails, not using handrails. And so that's kind of the gist of it. So for some specific exercises, without violating copyright law, so we got the rules here. That's not really, doesn't translate well to video. Let's get you some. So the low back pelvis progressions start out with something a bit lighter, but they're working up towards a bridging sort of exercise. And then also other muscles in a similar vein with like this clam with tubing, where you're pulling your hips out against resistance. Adduction, abduction. And then jumping on to, this is one out of the neck, mid-back, and upper extremity. This is kind of the start of the shoulder extension exercises. And they start out with no weight and progress from there up to tubing, I believe. There's some others with light weights too. It's also got some neck isometrics. So pushing against your head and then resisting it. And obviously it prescribes certain amounts of time and where to start and when to progress and that sort of thing. And then also in the upper extremity progressions, there's wrist strengthening. So you start out with no weight, and then later on they add light weights and do similar exercises. So it trains your wrists, gets them strong, which is certainly an area I found valuable. And then there's exercises such as these. They've got it as TYI, but there's a lot of different acronyms for shoulder exercises, and there's no consistency between them. So these are strengthening scapular retraction and that sort of good stuff. And just in general shoulder strength and like the stabilizers that'll help prevent injury. We got ball squeezes, and then there's kind of simpler exercises like tricep pushdowns. They've also got bicep curls. And I think that's great to include. I hadn't realized it, but your biceps and triceps actually do cross the shoulder. And so your triceps have some scapular involvement, your biceps are crossing the shoulder too, and biceps and triceps respond well to training, so it's kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of shoulder stability. Not necessarily the most pressing, but certainly worthwhile. And there's even TMJ exercises. Again, you push against and resist that with your jaw muscles. So one great thing about this is it does have, kind of hits all the areas, whereas most physical therapists, would be kind of at a blank for what to do with TMJ issues and stuff. Maybe that's not fair. A lot of physical therapists are probably quite familiar with it. Anyways, and then sidestepping with bands sort of things. We're getting into the lower extremities now. And so lots of kind of gentle band exercises. Here we've got a hamstring curl with tubing. Nothing too shocking there. And then working up to kind of step up sort of things, where you're stepping up onto a short platform. And that's the end of the like physical therapist led section. And then the final home exercise program is the last part of the book. So yeah, here's actually a solid summary. So Monday and Thursday, you've got sacroiliac and lumbar stabilization. And so there's several exercises in that vein that you can do. And then Tuesdays and Fridays is going to be mid-back and neck, upper extremities. And then, no surprise, Wednesday and Saturdays, there you've got your lower extremity progressions. And so it's a really sensible split. Yeah, phase 2 is those optional twisting, throwing, and balance progressions. And it does have like summaries of, if you get bleary-eyed trying to read it, you can go to the appendix and it has a breakdown of the lower extremity progressions, all the different progressions. So hopefully that's clarified what's in the book a little bit for you and wasn't too confusing. Now I'll kind of share my personal opinions of it, and they're mostly positive. I think there are some people who would really benefit from this, especially if you're I mean, obviously, EDS and symptom severity is such a spectrum. It's hard to say who it's appropriate for. But if you're struggling with, stuff like just like short walks and up and down stairs, and have a lot of subluxations, and your vertebrae are slipping out of place, and if you just if you want a really slow, safe, physical therapist driven program, this would definitely be appropriate for you. If you want a bit more ambitious program, or if you want to be more self-directed in it, then this might feel a little restrictive. One gripe I would have with it is there's really no exercise selection. So, for instance, there's a bunch of different ways to train grip strength, and all the different ways your wrists can move. And they've kind of just got one option. And the same thing with like the bridging exercises and all these other ones. There's usually a few different ways that you can hit the same muscle or the same group of muscles in a really similar way. And I've found, as I progress through my own exercises that I've selected, that it's sometimes you just kind of hit a wall on an exercise, and it's really nice to have some alternate exercises available so that you can kind of maintain the intensity and work at it from a slightly different angle. And then usually I found that I could come back to that first exercise after some time, and I kind of rounded out my muscles, and I had just sort of bolstered everything enough that now that first exercise wasn't a problem anymore. So I would just carry on with that first one. And in general, most of the time I found that my problems could be resolved with working on my execution and making sort of subtle tweaks to the exercises. But there were certainly times where it was nice to just say, I'm going to do, a different approach to grip training, or a different approach to bicep curls, or a different sort of curl, or just have options. On the other hand, options can lead you astray, and you can end up just sort of screwing around. So this makes sense, especially for physical therapist-driven exercise, because if you hit trouble with a particular exercise, your physical therapist can offer alternatives that aren't necessarily in the book. So that's totally reasonable. My other, maybe, I don't know if I'd call it a complaint, but I'll just say that there aren't really any compound movements intended to develop general strength, which is fair. This isn't intended to be a general strengthening program. It's a physical therapy program for people who are really prone to injury, and having them do intense exercises is obviously really dangerous. However, I personally think I've gotten a lot of benefit out of venturing into doing compound movements, and they don't have to be super intense, and everything can be scaled down to a level that's safer. But on the other hand, injuring yourself is going to be the number one obstacle. So throwing in strength work would be really ill-advised for most people. So again, for me, it would feel lacking in that area, but I don't think I'm necessarily the ideal candidate for this book. One other thing is that he doesn't really mention tendon strengthening or much about like the eccentric component of the exercise. So when you're pulling up, I can't see anything. This is the concentric phase where you're actively pulling, but then there's the eccentric phase where you're resisting that movement back down. And it's not necessarily a slam dunk, but there is some evidence that eccentric phase is unique and that it results in better tendon and connective tissue adaptation. So I've certainly tried to incorporate that in a lot of my exercises, where I'll put a good emphasis on the eccentric portion, and some of my exercises would even be like eccentric only, doing negatives. So, I don't know that that's necessarily, the science is strong enough to base an entire program on it, so maybe it's fair to leave it out. But just for me, I feel like it's worth mentioning, at least, that the eccentric portion of an exercise, at the very least, has value, but potentially is particularly valuable. The other interesting thing is that a lot of the signaling and communication for the eccentric phase of the exercise, the adaptation process, it follows kind of different pathways. So it's almost like there's these two different systems, and they're both valuable, but the concentric phase enables you to lift heavy things, and it seems most impressive. But the eccentric phase is going to bolster your connective tissue, and it's going to provide that stability so that you can resist movement and control a joint and stabilize it. So I really like isometric exercises and eccentric exercises, and I felt like maybe I expected them to get a mention. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I think basically it's kind of a classic physical therapy approach to the situation, where it's very cautious exercises, mostly focused on avoiding injury, gentle movement to encourage healing, and over time venturing into a little more intense exercises and building up strength in these areas that are most injury prone, which makes sense. It's a good approach. It's mostly isolation exercises. Like I said, you're not going to be doing incline push-ups on this, or incline rows or something like that. And then another thing is that they're sort of like short daily workouts, where you don't do the same thing day after day, but there's kind of something for every day. And the workouts aren't intended to deplete you completely or be devastating, and have this huge recovery load. This is something that hopefully could be integrated into your lifestyle without adding too much recovery demands. Whereas if you pursued a program more like I'm interested in, rigorous, strenuous strength progressions have a definite recovery period where you can't be doing anything strenuous, and you're going to be extra prone to injury and really wobbly the next day. So obviously, for an injury-prone population, that's a really risky proposition. That's all I have to say about that. Good book, maybe not appropriate for everybody, but there are certainly people in the EDS community who could really benefit from this, and hopefully you have a better idea now of whether or not that's you.